Hi, and welcome again to Dr. English YouTube channel. This is Dr. Mafi, and I'm a PhD in Applied Linguistics, and I've been teaching English for many years now. Well, today's lesson is very important, and I'm going to focus on or talk about prepositions. You might have heard it a lot or seen it in some texts, but it's a very confusing subject. What are prepositions? Prepositions are words that do not, in and of themselves, have meanings. They're somehow meaningless, one way or another. Of course, not totally meaningless, but they help the meaning of the sentence. How? By explaining the relationship between, or helping with the relationship between different elements or different words of a sentence. That's how they help the general meaning of the sentence. So without prepositions, sentences would be, in fact, somehow meaningless. We can't make head or tail of the sentences without the prepositions. Well, we use prepositions in many, many places, right? Prepositions such as of, from, at, on, in, between, through. All of these are prepositions. Whether we use prepositions for time, place, movement, position, or transportation, or even movement. So we can use these prepositions everywhere, actually. For each one of them, I try to be very brief in giving examples because this is a very wide area, let's say. I can, talk for hours, if not days, about prepositions and give you as many examples as you would like to hear, all right? But to be very short and sweet, of course, I try to, let's say, divided into these categories like time, place, movement, parts of a speech, position, all right, or even movement. Anyway, well, for example, parts of a speech, for each and every part of a speech, we have a preposition. Sometimes we use them before them, sometimes we use them after the parts of the speech. For example, for verbs, some verbs need prepositions, such as talk. So you have to use talk to someone, talk about something, it changes for the verb. Sometimes you don't use a preposition like discuss something without any preposition, or ask somebody a question. All right? So we don't use any preposition for some verbs, while for others we use some prepositions. So that's a very important note to be actually considered. Well, for nouns like discussion on, well, I said discuss doesn't require any preposition in and of itself because it's a verb, but discussion takes a preposition, like discussion on something, all right? Or in action, as I said, sometimes prepositions are used after, sometimes before, like especially when it comes before the nouns, well, we call them prepositional phrase or phrases, okay? Like in action, in progress, for example. For adjectives, like angry at. So for verbs and adjectives, we normally use the prepositions after them. But for nouns, sometimes before and sometimes after them, okay? That's another difference. Well, let's talk about time or prepositions of time. Well, I gave you 3 prepositions, like for time, like at. We use at for examples such as at noon, at night, at midnight, at midday, which means noon. It is a very specific time, specific point in time that we use at. Like at, for example, 3 o'clock, at 5 o'clock, because it's a very specific, special time, a point in time. Because it's a specific, or it is a very short, like a point in the axis of time, we use at noon, at night, at dawn, at sunrise, at dusk, at sunset, at breakfast, at present. You see? It means right now, at present. So right now has a specific point, or is a specific point in time. That's why we use at for. Well, on, like for longer periods, such as days, all of the weekdays, like on Friday, on Saturday, on what? The weekend. Weekend means 2 days. For example, whether it is Saturdays or Sundays, depending on where you live or reside, or I don't know, in some countries, for example, Fridays and Saturdays, sometimes like Thursdays and Fridays, So that's your weekend because it contains some days we use on for the days. On my birthday, on your birthday, because it has day in it, Whenever there is a day, we use on. What about in? It's a still longer period of time in comparison with at, right? And sometimes even with on, like days, like shorter, like in a minute, in a week, in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks' time means in future. Even in the past, in future. Or in a year, like for example, into 2025. In 1999. In, we use in, right? For weeks, for years, for months, for even seasons. In spring, in fall, in autumn, right? In winter, or in the winter. Sometimes we use that, sometimes we don't, all right? So for all of these scenarios or cases, we use in. Now, let's move on to prepositions of place. Again, we have at, on, and in, right? Like, if you give a specific point on a map, let's say, like on the street, you say at 2 Oak Street, means there is a specific place. Whether you give the number of the house or not, or the number of the street, then you have to use at, right? At 2 Oak Street. It means that it's a very specific place and everybody knows what point on the map I'm talking about, okay? So at home, at school, even villages, we use at for. Like at, for example, a different name, at a village, right? But for cities, we use in, which is bigger, or countries, or even continents. Anyway, on, well, the same street can be used with on, but without the number, as you can see, as you have noticed, all right? Or on the sidewalk, it means on something, right? But it's bigger than at, let's say. Or on the roof, on top of my head, for example, right? For in the street, especially when you're driving, for example, if you're in the street, you have to be extra careful, right? Stop jaywalking. Well, or sometimes even in a school. Here, I wrote at school, but I don't mean the inside part of the school. Generally, I mean that point on the map. But here, I mean inside the school. Of course, although some Americans use in a school, in university, instead of at university, at school. Okay, that's another case or another story. Well, in the house, it means inside the house. This in means inside, basically, all right? Or in a city like in London, in Tokyo, in Beijing, right? In Washington, D.C. Or in a country like in America, or I didn't even write continent, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, right? In North America. So all of them take in, okay? Now, let's go on to movement. We also use, sometimes, we use prepositions of movement, such as, for example, a square. You have to move around, walk around, drive around the square. So we use around. But if you go across the street from one side to the other side, one part to the other part on the street, we use across, right? Like the bridge, we go across the bridge, usually. Actually, we go across the river, but they normally use for the bridge too, all right? But if you're looking for somewhere, and I'm giving you the direction, so I would say, for example, the bank is along the street. It means that you have to go along the street. It means that go along the street, not across the street, either this way or that way, along the street. And normally, we differentiate it from down, which is nearly at the end of the street. Along, down, right? But if you, let's say, again, move from point A to point B, we say, for example, come across the class to me, from one corner to the other corner. Whether we are moving this way or that way, from point A to B, we use the preposition across. But if you mean you go, you move, or walk, or drive, in fact, in the same way, but there are some other objects or people or animal here on either side, we use through. We go through. For example, the teacher is walking through the chairs or through the students. It means that there are students here and there in the class and I'm walking through them, okay? Well, but if there's a wall and you want to jump over it, we say over, right? You jump or move over the wall. You can jump over, or sometimes some people use across for it too. Across the, for example, river, you jump across it, you know? Again, we also use across for it. But over means like you are on top of it, but move on top of it, right? So that's why we use prepositions of movement. I use them all in front of the prepositions of movement. But there are two other points left, and I would like to share it with you. And that is the prepositions of position. I try to make a distinction between preposition of movement and preposition of positions because these are like indicate movement. These prepositions indicate movement. But here, they're like located somewhere. Or I could, talk about them as prepositions or give another title to it, like prepositions of location, let's say, all right? Like these ones, somehow, locations like place. Like what? Like, for example, look at my example. B is situated or located between A and C. So if there are two things, be careful, if there are two things, and one thing, one object, one person is located between these two things, we use between. But if there are three things that surround an object or a person, like D is located among A, B, and C here. So if two things become three things, we use among, not between. Okay? That's one point. And the other point is the prepositions of location or position, like this. This is the best shape or drawing I can have in order to explain and illustrate, let's say, what I mean by up, down, under, over, over or below, whatever. Well, up and down are generally used to refer to something which is like on something, in an area, in a space above us. And anything below us is generally referred to as down, okay, generally. But to be more specific, we use these ones, these prepositions, okay? If something is exactly on the surface of an object, like this marker is on my hand, If I use this is in my hand. The marker is in my hand because I'm holding it tight, right? In. But if I put it like on the surface of my hand, on the actually palm of my hand, that would be on. But if it is placed or positioned like this, that would be underneath. Underneath. In literary style, we call it beneath, or old style speech, let's say. So underneath, on. But if there is a space in between, it goes a little bit above my hand. It's not on my hand, but it's what? Over, under, above, and below. These four are used. But depending on whether it is right above my hand in comparison, we say over. Over. Because it somehow covers this area. Over. Opposite of under. Under. Because it is covered by my hand. Or my hand is covered by this. Over. Right? For example, now I'm holding, like, for example, this eraser is over the blue marker. Now it is below the marker, okay? Over, under. But we also have above and below. Here, there is a diagonal position in relation, okay? Like, if this example, this is the best example I can give or show you here. Like, the position of this marker, where is it in relation to my hand? It's now above my hand. We don't say, to be more specific, we don't say over. Over is here, above. Under, below. You see, if the relationship is steep, diagonal, not straight, under it or over it, we say above and below. If it touches the surface of my hand, on. Underneath, right? These are very specific prepositions. Prepositions of position or location, okay? So I talked about up, down, over, under, you see, all of these prepositions. Okay, now the last point, but not least, prepositions of transportation. Okay? Generally speaking, for all means of transport, we use by. By plane, by train, by ship, by air, by sea, by land. Right? We use by, generally speaking. But sometimes you may hear like in a car, in a taxi. short vehicles, long vehicles, on a plane, on a ship, on a train, on a plane, right? So for longer vehicles, we also use on, but for shorter ones, the normal vehicles, we use in. Generally, we use by taxi, by car, by plane, by ship, right? Or by air, by land, okay? So we use generally by for all means of transport. Sometimes, more specifically, we use in and on. Of course, this session is not, in fact, limited. Well, I can talk about prepositions and many examples because we have lots of prepositions and lots of other examples. However, I try to limit it in this session as far as I could. Thank you very much for watching again. And if you have any comments, you know what to do. Drop us any questions or comments in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching us. Don't forget to like and subscribe.